The witness. I wish I could tell you exactly where this all started, but what I'm going to be telling you right now is all just my best recollection as to how it began. I don't know what is real anymore. Take whatever I say next with a healthy pinch of salt. The only context that is really needed here is that I am a court reporter. I will go into civil court proceedings, criminal trials, questionings at law firms, you name it, and I will write down whatever is said on my trusty steno machine. My first recollection of this person or thing is around 2 years ago. The first time I remember seeing the woman, I was in a questioning about a minor car accident. These proceedings were always quite boring, though sometimes could be very entertaining depending on who was involved. This particular questioning was of a witness by the name of Jillian Siegel. I will use the actual name I was always given because, frankly, good luck finding absolutely anything about this particular woman's existence. Believe me, I've tried. Something about Jillian was, well, something. I guess you could say off, but I can't even describe it in that sense. There was nothing unusual about her appearance or the way she spoke. Jillian was a very unassuming woman and looked like just about anybody you would see walking the street on a normal day. The one thing that I did find strange was how difficult I found writing her words. When I'm in a proceeding, because I'm so used to writing on my machine at this point, I'm usually just staring at a wall. But even though how she spoke was completely normal and at a normal rate of speed, I just couldn't write her words properly. I could only write her words effectively if I was staring directly at her, and even then, it was difficult. When I'm in a law firm setting, I am usually just off to the side somewhere. This is why I found it particularly unsettling when I had to look up at her again to write what she was saying, and she was staring directly into my eyes, unblinking. The thing that I found scariest about this is that her voice was conveying appropriate emotion, while her face and eyes were not. She continued to talk to the lawyers normally while just staring directly into me with a completely vacant expression. I gave a nervous glance to the lawyers, but they didn't seem to notice that she was doing this. I turned back to her, and she wasn't staring at me anymore. I didn't know what else to do but shrug it off, but I left that questioning very unsettled. This would have been fine if it was a one-and-done situation. But a few days later, I was scheduled for a preliminary inquiry on a potential drug trafficking trial, in court this time. I'm always given the names of the witnesses beforehand for the purpose of preparation, and there was that name again, Jillian Siegel. I have no idea why that name already started to fill me with so much dread. I tried to rationalize it and just laughed it off, just doing my best to find it funny how unlucky this woman was for being a witness to 2 events in quick succession where she needed to testify. I arrive in court and proceedings begin as usual. She was the second witness to testify, and when she came in, I felt fine at first. Now, unlike the law firm setting, while in court, the court reporter is always seated directly in front of the witness. So when she was in the witness box, I would have to do a full 180-degree turn to be able to look at her. This made me nervous because I remember how hard it was the first time to write her words. It was no different this time. There was just something about this particular woman that inhibited my ability to write, which was supposed to be second nature to me by now. I was just frustrated at this point, but at some point during her testimony, the feeling I got from the previous questioning came back. There was something inside me that just knew that if I turned back, she would be staring directly into me again. My entire body went into a cold sweat. I did my best to keep writing, and a huge feeling of relief washed over me when she was ordered to stand down. When she was exiting the courtroom, I looked at her, and there was nothing even slightly suggesting that she even knew I was there. I was angry at myself at this point. Why was I being so paranoid? She had done nothing wrong, and to be honest, I felt guilty for being so scared of her. When I got home, I sent the rough copy of the transcript and the audio of the proceedings to my proofreader and went about my day, and the thought of Jillian left my mind for a while. That is until I got a call from my proofreader. His name was Mike. When I answered the phone, I could tell Mike was finding something funny. He explained to me that at some point during the transcript, my writing began going way off of what was actually being said. He joked to me that it was like I had dozed off and began writing something from a dream or something. Now, this isn't unheard of. Sometimes when I have a rough night the day before a job, I will doze off and begin writing complete gibberish until I jolt myself awake again. But there was a feeling that I got when Mike was laughing about this. There was that knowing again. Knowing that, when I took another look at the transcript, I would not like what I saw. I hung up the phone and immediately opened up my file of the rough copy and scrolled down to where Gillian Siegel was sworn in. Everything was relatively normal at first. The difficulty of writing down what she was saying was apparent, although I could fill in the gaps. But scrolling down further, I immediately figured out what Mike was talking about. I started reading something that almost sounded like it was coming from the middle of a story from a children's book. In the middle of Gillian's testimony, I read the following. Now, this man was always a good reader. Ever since he was a small boy, people would always compliment him on how well he was able to read. His teachers, parents, and friends were always so very impressed by his skill. After this, there was something that couldn't be taken as anything else but foreboding. Car, I am on the highway. Stop. The regular testimony started again. Then, Henday, week 6. The only thing I could connect out of this was Henday and highway, as the Henday is the name of a highway that is close to my city. The rest of the transcript was relatively normal. Something about this oddity in my transcript suffocated me with a type of dread I didn't know was possible. The part about the highway was clearly ominous, but I had no idea who the man the childlike passage was supposed to be about. I guess I would later find out. 6 weeks later, I was once again scheduled for a questioning, and there it was, oh so very unassuming, Gillian's name again listed along with the witnesses. To be honest, because of how busy I was, while I hadn't forgotten about her, she was no longer at the forefront of my mind. But reading her name again, a chill that wouldn't cease for minutes ran through my body. I shivered uncontrollably. I couldn't blame her showing up repeatedly as coincidence anymore. There's just simply no way that someone could be called to testify this many times in different cases in such a short period of time. That morning, going to that job was the last thing that I wanted to do. But something pulled me to go, and I couldn't resist. When I was at this job, I didn't even know what it was about. I was too terrified to care, and just came to write. I would later find out while going through the transcript that it was about an assault. The proceedings were mostly a blur to me, but then came Gillian. The familiar cold sweat started, and as she was walking up to the witness box, for the first time since my first encounter with her, she made fleeting eye contact with me. Now, this could have been me being paranoid, but I swear I saw something in those eyes that seemed like she was smirking at me. There was nothing in her facial expression, but those eyes. Her testimony started, and this time that horrible feeling was with me the whole time she was behind me. The feeling that at any time I turned around, she would be staring at me with that horrible vacant look. Something even worse happened this time, though. At some point, she just stopped speaking, and the courtroom went silent, as if this thing was just begging me to turn around to look at her. When I looked at everyone in the courtroom, it didn't seem like everyone else was experiencing what I was. They all still seemed to be listening attentively, even though there was nothing to be heard. The fear I felt in this moment was indescribable. I was trying to bring myself to look back at her, but as soon as I turned my head just a little bit, I looked down and saw her shoes. She was standing behind me. I immediately forced my eyes shut and tried desperately to convince myself I was imagining this whole thing. After about 10 seconds, I heard a grotesque snicker coming from Gillian that sounded neither like a man or woman. I was no longer able to keep my composure at this point, and I almost dove out of my chair. I fell to the ground, and when I stood back up, Gillian was back in the witness box again, looking at me in confusion. I looked around at everyone else, and they had the same look. As a form of denial of what I just experienced, I just apologized and sat back down to continue writing. The rest of the proceedings went without incident. I got home, sent the rough copy to Mike, and I drank. A lot. Over the next couple of days, I noticed that I did not get anything back from Mike. I found this to be unusual because he was always very quick with his editing and would always keep me updated. I decided to give him a call. The phone was answered, but instead of Mike, a woman picked up. This woman was crying inconsolably and was clearly very drunk. I asked her who she was and asked if Mike was available. I was able to pick up, "He's fucking dead, and it's my fault." I was devastated, and was also devastated for this woman who was clearly his girlfriend. While Mike worked for me, I did always consider him to be a friend. I asked her when this happened, and she said it happened 4 days prior. I couldn't help but notice that was the day directly before Jillian showed up again. But what confirmed this dreadful feeling I got from this was what she said after. According to her, the last words he ever said to her were, "I am on the highway, stop fucking calling me." It likes to look like family. I never believed the stories when I was little. Grandmother would always tell me how the women in our family were plagued by a horrifying demon, an angry demon. She told us that once the woman it was attached to died, it moved on to the next female of the next generation. I asked her why the demon was so angry. Grandmother didn't know. Her best guess was that a female ancestor must have communed with the demon in some way. Perhaps she made a deal to trade the torment of her descendants for wealth, beauty, or power. Or maybe the demon was betrayed by the woman and sought revenge with a wrath strong enough to burn through the generations. There were many stories as to the origin of the demon. It had even become a family tradition to see who could come up with the best story of the mysterious ancestor that had supposedly started this curse. It was all good, scary fun, but I never believed a word. Grandmother was in hospice care, and my mother, father, and I were visiting after the doctors contacted us to inform us that grandmother could pass away at any moment. She looked frail and had a faraway look in her eyes as she lay in her bed during her final minutes. She looked at my mother and said, "Come here, my darling Ellie." My mother kneeled beside her. "It's going to go to you now. Ignore it if you can and never listen to it." "Sure, Mom, don't worry, I'll be okay," my mother had said. I could not believe that of all the things to have on her mind during her final moments, the demon was the focus of her last words. Less than 5 minutes later, grandmother's lungs emptied her breath one last time, after 81 years of reliably circulating oxygen. I thought I would break down in tears. To my surprise, I instead stood stoically as if frozen in time. I had no thoughts at that moment, no emotions, and a strange suspicion as to whether I even existed. Shock, I suppose. Later that evening, my mom and I were in the kitchen washing dishes in silence. I could feel her eyes as she gazed over at me. "How are you doing, sweetheart? You haven't said much since we were with your grandma." I didn't have much to say in truth, at least not about the loss of my grandmother. The grief had yet to really sink in. So I replied, "I guess I just don't really know what I should be thinking or feeling. Still processing, I guess." "That's perfectly normal, sweetie. You don't have to say anything. If you do, though, I'm here." "Don't you think it was kind of strange that the demon story nonsense was what she talked about at the end? I mean, I guess I'd expected something more family-related or profound." My mother gave the expression she always has when she enters focused contemplation, as if her response to my inquiry could have some sort of critical consequences. Well, she was very old and sick. Sometimes the brain gets jumbled and confused when people get to that kind of state. "Yeah, I suppose that's true," I said. "Okay, how about we try and see if we can get some sleep?" My mother turned to leave. Suddenly she shrieked and jolted backward enough to bump into me. I dropped the glass that I had been holding. Glass shattered and scattered across the tile floors. "Oh, damn it, I'm sorry, sweetie." She bent down and began gathering up the larger shards of glass. "It's okay, what happened?" I asked. "Huh? Oh, nothing. My emotions are just a little all over the place. Guess I got a little easily startled and wasn't expecting to see Dax behind me when I turned. Dax was our family bulldog. After cleaning up the glass, we all went to bed. I had trouble sleeping. The grief over the loss of my grandmother had finally caught up with me, right in the middle of the night. I had learned that night that I was going to be one of those people who have the tendency to defer difficult feelings to the quiet, dark, lonely night. Ironically, my lonely private time to be in grief ended when a high-pitched scream rattled its way through the halls of our house. It was my mother. I jolted from my bed and hurried down the hall to my parents' room. My dad had his arm wrapped comfortingly around my mother's shoulders. An eerie sense of dread filled my heart. Something wasn't right with my mother. "Mom, what's going on?" Although I wondered if I really wanted to know. "It's been a difficult day. I think the grief is just hitting your mother hard," my father replied reassuringly. My mother was shaking her head back and forth in short bursts. She held her hand up to the side of her face as if shielding her eyes. She was muttering, it's here, it looks like her, but it isn't." "Shh, it's okay," my dad whispered, trying to calm her down. "Sweetheart, go back to bed, it's okay." "Wait, what was that?" "Go to bed, please, everything is okay, just let me take care of your mom right now, okay?" "Sure, fine, whatever." I reluctantly returned to my room. I knew that grief could show up in a lot of different and unexpected ways. But I also knew my mother, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something other than grief happening to her. I never would have imagined, however, that the conversation I had with my mother in the kitchen would be the last conversation I'd have before she entered a complete and total psychosis. After losing my grandmother, followed by my mother's mental breakdown, I went about my days almost completely in a state of apathy. After a month or so, I began to appreciate being in that emotional state of non-emotion. Sure, the colors of the earth seemed a bit more faded, but all the pressures of things that used to seem so important now barely even entered my radar. It had been 7 months since my mother's mental condition escalated to the point where my father had no choice but to seek the help of psychological professionals. This required my mother to be institutionalized. I fought with my dad about this decision. I didn't think an institution was the best place for her. My dad had given up arguing and made the decision to have her sent away. We hadn't spoken since. I went to visit my mother at the mental hospital on chilly Wednesday afternoon. The orderly I met at the front desk had me follow her into what appeared to be a cafeteria area, judging by the tables that ran across each side of the room. My mother was sitting at one of these tables. When I joined her, I had to fight the urge to cry. I didn't want my mother to see me in distress while she needed to focus on her own healing. "Hi, Mom. How you are feeling?" I asked. Her eyes were a little bloodshot and her hair was wild and frizzy. She stared blankly down at the table. "Not saying anything today?" My mother remained silent. "When we spoke last in the kitchen, you told me that if I wanted to talk, you'd be here. Is that still true?" At this, my mother's eyes looked up at me. She still hadn't spoken, but just by looking at me, I felt a rush of cautious optimism that I maybe could get her to speak. "I wanted to ask you something. It could be important. Do you think you can try to help me?" My mother nodded her head rapidly and leaned in closer. Yes, okay, Mom, that's good. I wanted to ask you, that night after we talked, and I came into your room when I heard you scream. My throat was tight, and I could feel my heart pounding hard in my chest. I feared the answer to the question I was about to ask, but I knew that it was a question that needed to be asked. You were muttering something about she or her being here, something like that. Were you talking about Grandma? My mother moaned. No, not Grandma, just looking like Grandma. I was confused. Her words didn't seem to make sense. What do you mean? Did you or didn't you see Grandma? Please, Mom, I know it's hard, but please try. Taking a sudden deep breath, my mother straightened up in her seat. It likes to look like family. I didn't want to accept what I suspected my mother was referring to. I don't understand. Mother smiled wide, eerily. You will soon. This was the end of our conversation. Although I would not find out until later, my mother would end her own life that night. She had broken a glass, and before the orderlies could respond, she used one of the shards to cut her own throat. This news would not reach me until the morning of the next day. I would also learn another haunting piece of information. Around the time that my mother had passed away in the mental hospital, I was in my room, sitting at my desk and writing in my diary. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. The house was old and had hardwood floors. I heard the sudden creak of the floorboards down the hall from my room, where the stairs were that led into the foyer. My dad had been away for the last couple of days for business. I wasn't expecting him to be home for another day, but I thought perhaps he had gotten back ahead of schedule. So I called out, "Dad? Are you home?" There was no answer. I sat looking at my open doorway for a moment. I felt a chill and the familiar pounding of my heart as fear started creeping through me. I never minded being home alone before, but something inside me sensed that the house now had darkness looming over it. I wished to myself that my dad or mom or a friend, anyone was there with me. Another, louder creak of the floors echoed from down the hall. "Hey, this isn't funny, Dad." That was last moment in which I had hoped that my dad was going to enter my room laughing at his little scare. That hope died when I saw it. First came an outstretched foot, sticking out from the side of my doorframe. It was pale and dirty. Suddenly it landed on the floor with a crooked step. The other leg swooped around, and with it the rest of what had been making those creaking sounds on the floorboards. I felt paralyzed. Never had I ever even fathomed that fear could so powerfully consume me. My mouth didn't listen to my commands to shout. My heart didn't listen to my commands to slow down, nor did my legs, arms, or any other muscle in my body listen to what my mind wanted. My eyes were fixated in horror at the sight of my mother in the doorway of my room. Only I knew it wasn't really my mother. It stood like her, but it didn't walk naturally. It staggered unsettlingly, as if it were learning to walk. One arm appeared to be twisted around backward. The most disturbing thing about it was its neck, which was broken horizontally, so far that the bone protruded from the skin, and its head, with the face of my mother, looked at me sideways, with her jaw opened wide enough that it should not have been attached at the hinges. It had empty black sockets where its eyes should have been, yet I felt its gaze piercing through to my bones. My soul had never been so close to the presence of real evil. Then it spoke with an inhuman voice, which seemed to speak right from within my own head rather than from where it stood in my door. "It's gonna be just you and me now." If you ever hear the floor creak at night or spot something from the corner of your eye, just ignore it. Finally, followed by a huge sigh of relief, is what I thought after setting down the cardboard box marked "my stuff" in the living room of my new home. The relief wasn't that of any physical exhaustion since the house came furnished. It was more of a mental relief. Aside from the tedious search on the market for one that fit my paid peanut salary, I could finally say I was out of that fucking apartment. Now you might think that's a little ungrateful and exaggerated, especially for those that have lived or are living in a shitty apartment. But trust me when I say mine was exactly that, shitty. From the garbage heating system to the repulsive growing mold on every corner, I'm surprised it was even legally allowed to be up for rent. But then again, the neighborhood wasn't all that great either. It was the kind that required every window to be barred and every street to be surveillanced past sundown. If I'm being brutally honest though, all those things were just little gripes that fed the real reason I couldn't live there anymore. To me, the whole place felt like a cage, and not because of the barred windows or my need to install 4 locks on my door, but because it was a reminder that I would be stuck there forever with no indication of a better future. So I began to save up some money. I laid off on the useless spendings, got a better job, 2 jobs actually. As much as I hated the place, I will say it was a hell of a motivator. Anyway, during the time I was saving up to move out, I came across a tear-off flyer as I was taking my morning jog down to the park. It read, "Home for sale" in bolded red letters and displayed printed images of the home. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. It was 10 miles north of where I lived in a city you can say lacked the kind of excitement you'd find down here. Below there was the price, $140,000. This immediately got me questioning the liability of the flyer, but then as if placed to diminish all doubt, all the flyer's labels except one blew loosely in the wind. I stared at it for a while and finally ripped the whole thing from the wooden pool and stuffed it into my pocket. One phone call later and a lot of paperwork, and here I was, in my own home, and finally free from that cage. It wasn't all that much, but given I've been living in the saddest excuse for an apartment for over 6 years, it was basically a mansion. An old mansion, that is. It was as though the whole thing was pulled right from the Victorian era. There was a matching intricate floral design on the walls, carpets, and curtains throughout the entire house. In almost every room, a large chandelier hung conspicuously around the furniture that was as chaotic as Van Gogh's painting palette, mismatched colors and cramped knickknacks on every drawer. It was odd to me that someone would sell a house that looked like someone was still living in it. I mean, I've seen furnished homes for sale, but the furniture was usually new, neat, and appealing to look at. This, on the other hand, gave me a sense of claustrophobia and made my eyes go fuzzy just staring at it. I found it even more bizarre that the house was up at such a low price, and there were no other potential buyers, despite the torn labels from the flyer. Still, I bought it. I mean, who wouldn't? The real estate agent representing the seller was a slender older woman, and judging by what she was wearing, time was having a pretty rough time passing through her too. She wore a black pointed gown, tightly secured with a corset that did more harm than good. Thick strands of greasy hair escaped from under her dark bonnet like snakes slithering out of their nest. She was friendly, though. There was almost this forced nature to her. Her voice was too soft for her appearance. Her unusual bony fingers twitched anxiously on her hands like they had a mind of their own. And her smile sat on her face like a heavy dumbbell pulling down on her aged skin. Hard to imagine living here with all this furniture. I can't believe someone would just leave like this. I guess some people are just eager to move out. Yeah, tell me about it. You know, this place can use someone young like you. Someone with enough energy to lighten up the place. Just think of it as a game. I stood there still in a state of pride and a little excitement. I scanned the living room, then the dining room, and finally the kitchen. It felt odd not having them less than 3 feet from each other, or the fact that the space between the three wasn't a bedroom. I found myself touring around again, occasionally examining some of the antique items on the shelves like I was in some yard sale. There's no way I'm keeping all of this up. I moved to the kitchen, staggering over my feet, since the mattress my mind was so used to avoiding was no longer there. I opened the kitchen cabinets. The previous owner had even left his silverware. They looked new, but I'd rather not take any chances. I turned to head toward the staircase leading to the bedrooms upstairs when I heard a door slowly sway open. The creaking of the hinges doubled in the silence. It was a door to a small empty closet in the living room. I walked over. I swear this was never here. I guess I never noticed. I closed the door and made my way upstairs toward my bedroom. Naturally, I chose the most spacious of the 3 bedrooms for myself. It also happened to be the one with the least amount of furniture. There was a mahogany wardrobe on one end and a king-sized canopied bed on the other. Next to it, a nightstand accompanied with a night lamp that looked as though spiders had spun its lampshade. There was also a large built-in closet with sliding doors. I slid the closet door open, half expecting it to be full of clothes and shoes, but it was empty. I guess the owner wasn't gracious enough to leave his clothes behind. Just then, I felt a cold breeze brush up against my neck. I turned, pawing at my neck. No windows. I can't remember what drew me to look up at the ceiling, but I did. I noticed a faint outline of an attic door above me. The ceiling was high enough so that no normal person could reach it without some sort of elevation, and there was no drawstring to pull down a ladder either. The saleswoman never mentioned an attic. Maybe it belonged to an attic long ago sealed. But why leave the entrance marked? Or maybe there was an attic and it too was filled with junk even older than what was down here. Either way, it was mine now, and I was curious enough to investigate. I stared at it for a while because I remember the aching sting on my neck when I looked down for any possible way to get to it. Then the phone call came. The loud ringing of a phone shot through the house. I instinctively looked down at my phone, but there was no incoming call. With that, my ears honed in on the sound. It was coming from the living area downstairs. As I made my way down, I noticed it had that old high-pitched bell sound of an old dial phone. The black dial phone was hiding among the many relics in the living room. I let it ring longer, hesitant to answer, somehow knowing the call would be unsettling. Finally, I answered. "Hello." A stretched static sound made me pull away from the phone. I called out again. No answer, just static. Then a faint, raspy, and distant voice fighting through the static spoke. "Don't look around." "What? Who is this?" Don't look around. Don't play the game. Just ignore it." Before I could give another bewildered response, the static fired a hard ring that stung my ears to their very core. I dropped the phone in pain, shutting my eyes so tight I saw white. In a fit of rage, I pulled the whole thing right from where it laid and threw it against the wall. It shattered. What the fuck was that? A prank call? Yeah. And maybe the damn thing was too old to handle another call. Yeah, that's it. That night, after pulling off the sheets that came with the bed and replacing them with my own, I laid there in the dark, chasing sleep. You would think that on my first night in my new home, I would sleep soundlessly with a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. But that wasn't the case. Every time I'd close my eyes, I'd hear the floor creaking downstairs. After a while, the creaking would be accompanied by subtle kicks on the walls like someone was running or playing downstairs. The whole thing brought back those frustrating memories of my upstairs neighbors living their lives in the night like some nocturnal animals. My restless mind echoed the warnings given to me through the phone. Just ignore it. Don't play the game. Was this some sick joke someone was playing on me? What a coincidence that as soon as I got a call telling me to ignore it, the whole floor suddenly became some rickety bridge blowing in the wind. Maybe I was overthinking it. The phone call just had me on high alert. I read somewhere before that the creaking you hear in the night is just your home's wooden structure contracting and expanding. I kept telling myself that and zoned out moments later. The next morning, I quickly noticed that the weak flooring was permanent. Everywhere I stepped, the floor would creak, despite it not ever doing that the day before, or the times I was in the house with the saleswoman. I also began to notice other changes or gripes I hadn't noticed before. The floral designs on the walls, carpets, and curtains were faded like if someone had laid a veil of permanent dust over them. The silverware, along with most of the antique items, appeared older, splotches of grime and millions of tiny imperfections all over them. I even found some of the items rusting. The furniture appeared worn out and dirty, which gave me a slight feeling of disgust. The house itself had this smoky aroma that reminded me of old books. I would be lying if I didn't say regret crept into my mind then, or that my eagerness might have blinded my senses, but it was still far better than my apartment. In the days following, I focused on cleaning out the house of all those antique items. After the phone call, the items started to rub me the wrong way. They felt alive, like each one had permanently open eyes. Despite my efforts to take them down and shove them into one of the bedrooms, I'd still get the sense that someone was watching me. I would turn, but again, there would be nothing there. Once I was so certain something was watching me from behind that I turned a corner pretending I didn't know. Then, like a little kid anxiously waiting to scare someone, I peeked my head out from the corner waiting to see what or who would come out. Of course, nothing ever came out. I looked so stupid, and I knew then that I was becoming paranoid. The kicking and creaking continued every night, which was something I was failing to get used to. I bought some earplugs and even tried to sleep in different bedrooms to see if that would change anything. It didn't. One night, I got into bed, inserted my earplugs, and began some breathing exercises I learned on YouTube to help with sleep. My mind was fading into nothing when this loud bang pierced through my earplugs. I quickly sat up from my bed. A second bang came from my door like a vicious knock, followed by running footsteps on the other side. I now faintly remember the childlike laughter that came after, though at the time everything happened so fast. I stormed out of my bed and violently swung the door open. I looked down the hall. "You think this is funny? Huh?" I screamed from my door. There was no response. I searched the entire house that night. Again, nothing like always. I wasn't scared and never once thought the house was haunted. That isn't real, right? I was mad. Mad that I could barely sleep at night. Mad that I couldn't relax in my own home. And worst of all, mad that my old apartment was sounding more and more livable each day. Then one day, as I was cleaning out the other bedroom pretending everything was normal, a sudden salty, penetrating smell wafted into my nose. I covered my nose with the back of my hand, but the pungent smell lingered. It was moist and reminded me of all sorts of dead animals. It didn't take me long to pinpoint its origin. Under the bedside table was a clear, almost silvery puddle of a thick, viscous liquid. The sight of it, along with the growing smell, made me gag. Under it were large, savage scratch marks, scarring into the old wooden floor. As I stared, completely confused at what I was looking at, I noticed more of the scratch marks around the bed. Then it hit me. The house was infested. It wasn't the natural movements of the wooden floor that was causing the insufferable creaking and banging. It was the scurrying of the rats or some other rodents. My paranoia was probably just a response to the answer I knew deep down. To think that those fuckers had me question if the house was haunted would have been laughable if it weren't for the sudden anger and hatred that boiled in me. I was determined to find them and kill them. I searched the house slowly and cautiously. Knowing that they could be anywhere made my skin crawl in disgust. As I looked behind and around the furniture of the living room, I heard one nearby, behind me. I turned, my eyes immediately locked onto the couch. It's behind the pillow. I slowly made my way to it, choosing a lamp as my weapon. In an instant, I moved the pillow out of the way and was about to strike, but nothing was there. Suddenly, something knocked some of the knickknacks off one of the drawers behind me and scurried out of the living room in a flash. I didn't see it, but I heard its nails scraping against the floor. After a while of searching and after I cooled down, I knew I wasn't going to catch it, and even if I did, judging by the amount of scratch marks, it wasn't just one. I needed traps. I went to the store to purchase some and set them all around the house. Now all I had to do was wait. That night, I slept the most I ever had since I moved. There was barely any, if not no, creaking and banging. In the morning, I sprinted downstairs like a child would the morning of Christmas Day, only I wasn't excited about big, colorful presents. I was excited to see my nightmare end, trapped and lifeless. The smile on my face disappeared as quickly as it took me to get downstairs. The traps were empty, no presents, no rest, and definitely no peace. But I had a plan. I was hoping to save some money, but there was no way in hell I was going to live here one more day like this. I started upstairs to my bedroom. I grabbed my phone, pulled up a phone number for an exterminator, and headed for the door when from the corner of my eye, I saw a mass on the ground near my bed. It was on all fours and was about the size of a medium-sized dog. The rest of its details blurred, though I remember the smell. It was a decaying, suffocating aroma. I twisted my head to see it, but before I could, it scuttled under my bed. This is it. I blindly reached for whatever, a broom, as I steadily moved closer. Slowly I crouched, keeping my distance. I heard it retreating deeper, hiding behind some boxes. The smell was unbearable. There was a faint whimper, or my mind refusing to believe it, a concealed laughter. I heard its nails gripping tighter against the floor. With the broom's handle, I suddenly swiped one of the boxes to the side. In a blur, it moved out from under the bed. The sliding door of the closet closed shut before I even had time to look up. The speed of it was unnerving. I suddenly felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I moved closer, the storm of a million questions in my mind winning over the instinctual feeling to run. I was unable to feel anything but my heart pounding out of my chest. I tightened my grip on the broom as I felt my hands go clammy. I reached for the sliding door, my hand hovering over it, trembling. Right when I slid the door open, the thing came bursting out. I fell to the ground. It ran out of my room, giggling like a child. It was a child or the size of one. I stared, frozen in shock. It was human-like, only its skin was pale, almost translucent. I saw its bleached purple veins webbing throughout its unnatural and misshapen body. It was layered over the disgusting, shimmering coat of that silvery liquid. The smell was like a physical mist that burned my eyes. On the ground, it left a trail of its viscous liquid. I followed it downstairs and into the living room. There it was, in a corner with its crooked back to me. It had its hands raised to its face, and in a childlike voice it began to count down from 10. With every number, its voice became more distorted. and its back began to stretch and grow as if something was trying to escape from under its pale skin. My stomach knotted as it doubled in size. Time slowed down for me. Don't play the game. Just ignore it. Just think of it as a game. This whole time, this thing was living in my house, or I was living in his. And that feeling that something was watching me, it was this. This creature playing some game of hide and seek with me. And it was finally my turn to hide. Before it could finish its sick, distorted countdown, I found what courage I had left and ran blindly upstairs. I heard it finish and give a gargling, deep laugh. I felt its footsteps reverberating, crashing down on the ground. I made it to my room and shut the door, barricading it with the wardrobe. I backed away to a corner and sobbed. I've been in my room all day and can still hear it searching downstairs. Sometimes it comes up, its large shadow passing through under the gap of the door. I freeze completely still as it passes by, giving out its heavy breathing and weak, almost painful laughs. Just the thought of it finding me is beyond terrifying.